I heard you discussing Jake Tapper on Thursday or Wednesday of last week, and I agree with your take that he has taken on a humble tone because he was forced to do so, right?
Yes. He hired an emergency publicist. They're not called publicists, they're emergency specialists. And he was trained in certain talking points, such as humility, because the initial talking points from his team was that he was a courageous truth seeker all along. But that didn't work. He got humiliated by reality. And so he was trained to say, I'm humbled.
Yes. And, that's just the baseline is that the whole situation is very funny. It's like he wrote a book uncovering the mental decline of Biden and the cover-up, and he was part of the cover-up. So just baseline, very ironic, very rich with humor. But to your point, imagine like an adolescent gets in some kind of conflict with someone at school, and his mom says, you need to say sorry. And so the kid goes, okay, like, I'm sorry. And you can say, well, that apology, in my opinion, is not 100% genuine. But on the other hand, it's like at least the kid had the moral sense that he has stepped out of line and now he's done the right thing and he said sorry. So do you take it at face value or do you question the kid's motives when he says sorry?
Most people just take it at face value because it's just simply easier.
Right. It's easier, but it's also just, I believe that when someone's in kind of like a defensive crouch and they're saying sorry and they're saying, I'm being humble, like he's self-identifying, I'm humble. So he is, by definition, he's been humbled because he's literally saying that I'm humble. And therefore, from my perspective, it's difficult to keep haranguing him when he said, I apologize to Lara Trump for that viral clip. Now, again, baseline is he's a dishonest, partisan guy, and we already all know that. But after he already admits some degree of culpability, maybe not as much as we would like, I find it difficult to keep on hammering on the guy.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Megyn Kelly, though, did have a pretty good rejoinder when she was talking to Mark Halperin, who really put Jake Tapper to task, not so much for Jake Tapper as Jake Tapper, but as an embodiment of the overall media's failed coverage of Joe Biden's obvious cognitive infirmity. And Megyn Kelly makes the point that Jake Tapper's line, I'm humbled, doesn't feel authentic because it's so limited. So if you're truly humbled, it would extend and it would have ramifications, but instead, it just feels like a publicist-trained line that he trots out, and you don't see the ramifications of it, and so it doesn't feel particularly real. It gets the job done. So most people are not going to keep haranguing Jake Tapper or anyone who makes an apology, but depends how important they are to your life. Or how much attention you give. So this line will work for most people. For other people, it will seem inadequate.
Well, I think the ramifications are basically a kind of public humiliation that he's become like the meme for liberal hypocrisy. And he's clearly seen that blowback on social media, which is like a beautiful thing. So I kind of feel like the point has been made and he's received the point. And he's expressed some degree of contrition. And as to Megyn Kelly, I watched that interview and I just felt like it was a little bit over the top. And, Megyn does a good job. She was very prepared. And I'm sure she did a better job than I could have because she was just like in command of all the facts and whatnot. But I almost came away with that from that interview, like sympathetic to Jake Tapper, and which is, a very ironic place if you got me there because as I said, he just presented himself as soft-spoken and humble and he didn't try to argue. And she really came in there with like a sledgehammer. That's kind of her style, right? You could have gone in with a scalpel. You could have made it funny. You could have used understatement. You could have used irony, but instead she came up, her tone was a little sanctimonious, I say, with all due respect to Megyn Kelly.
Okay, I think this is like with most things, the individual, his mileage will vary. I thought she did an excellent job, and I don't think she belabored her points. I think she made her points, and I think they were pretty strong and pretty convincing. Other people who are perhaps not as informed. See, he didn't initially go with the humble route. His book is not an example of the humble route. He tried to pull off that he was always a courageous truth teller. And his book does not acknowledge how he covered up Joe Biden's obvious cognitive decline. He's only been dragged into the humble route, kicking and screaming. And so he tried to pull off a false front for as long as possible. And then only when he was repeatedly humiliated was he dragged kicking and screaming into I'm humble. But his embodiment of I'm humble doesn't seem authentic because it just seems so limited. It just feels like a line he trots out, and then some people will have your reaction and others won't. Pass.
Well, of course he's not going to admit his culpability, because how would that even work? Like a forward to the book, by the way, I'm a complete hypocrite and I'm not the guy that should be writing this. So I feel like when he does a limited hangout and he says that he could have done more and I'm humble and I apologize, it's kind of like a tacit admission that there's a lot of hypocrisy going on, even if he doesn't literally say that, just because it would just be untenable to do otherwise. And let me just remind people listening, like, I'm not a Jake Tapper defender. I just thought the criticism of him, or like the confrontation, just didn't work for me.
So what do you make of the fact that the cognitive elite and the academic elite and the media elite consistently told us that Joe Biden was fine? For example, I went through Google Scholar. I could not find one academic who cast any doubt prior to Joe Biden's 2024 debate with Donald Trump on Joe Biden's fitness, cognitive, and physical for office. Not one. Instead, you find countless elite medical academics signing their name to analyses saying that Joe Biden's just fine. You find hundreds of academics casting doubt on Donald Trump's physical and cognitive fitness for office. And so what do you make of the fact that the cognitive elite told us that Joe Biden was just fine, and your average American, including your average Democratic Party voter, said he's not fine?
I think it's outrageous. And it just shows you that, the experts are sometimes going to lie, hearkening back to that big debate. But I guess I'm taking a long time to get to what my core point is here, which is that I don't think that the conservative media should do like a victory lap because they reported the facts about Joe Biden's mental decline. Like, does Megyn Kelly deserve a Pulitzer Prize in journalism for saying that Joe Biden is incoherent?
No, but I don't believe that Jake Tapper and Joe Scarborough were lying in the sense that they knew that they were covering up for an enfeebled president. They saw what they wanted to see, just like you and I see what we want to see. I know women who are as hot as F and as dumb as rocks. And I am strongly incentivized to think that they are much smarter than they really are because they are so hot. And so we all tend to encounter the world as we want it to be, through the prism of our own desires rather than the reality. So when Joe Scarborough said in 2024, this is the best Joe Biden ever, I don't believe he was lying. I don't believe that his assertion bore any resemblance to reality, but I believe that it was the normal product of he saw what he wanted to see, just like the rest of us see what we wanted to see. So I don't believe that the elite media, including Jake Tapper, were knowingly lying. I think they saw what they wanted to see, and it just shows the power of desire to blind us to reality.
Absolutely. And, it's difficult to say that someone is deliberately lying as opposed to deceiving themselves. And, that's something I talked about in my channel too. I talked about Jake Tapper and I talked about Scarborough. Joe Scarborough, when you compare the two, I mean, at least Jake Tapper has expressed some self-awareness, even if you say that he's been kind of obligated to do so. Scarborough continues to maintain that, like, he had it right. But again, getting back to conservative media, like, and let me repeat, I like Megyn Kelly, but basically what she said to Jake Tapper at one point said something like a throwaway line, like, well, if we stick to the facts, then, and you have no idea what he's going to say, but she just jumped in right there and she said, I have stuck to the facts on my show, unlike you. So again, very sanctimonious and probably true, but
I've learned as a host to interrupt people when they say again, because we don't need to repeat the point. So conservative media, I think, deserve a victory lap in that they were correct that Joe Biden was enfeebled and cognitively not all there.
Okay, but when I say again, I don't mean I'm going to literally repeat myself, but just I'm circling back to a previous area of explanation, which is that what Megyn Kelly did was she watched TV and then she just like talked about her impression of Joe Biden. So my point is just that like literally anybody, any anonymous right-wing account on X could have done the same thing and did. And so I don't find that conservative media, I don't find did like a particularly awesome job in the 2024 election, although I'm glad it exists and I'm glad that it's out there criticizing Democrats. But it was just this Biden is old was just the subject of so many like tired, repeated jokes. And then when you really like look into the content of conservative media, the way that they criticized Joe Biden was like, oh, he's not being tough enough on Russia, or he's not being like tough enough on the Gaza situation, or he needs to get, it was like basically just doubling down on like neoliberal talking points. That's why I find it kind of irritating that they want to feel vindicated because they made the most obvious point by literally just watching TV and saying, oh, he sounds old.
Well, sometimes saying the most obvious point is an incredible act of courage. You will have a very painful life if you say a lot of very obvious points about reality. You will be isolated. Only one woman in 1,000 is likely to stick by you if you simply remark on things that are just blindingly obvious. So to the extent that the conservative media noticed and remarked accurately and honestly that Joe Biden was not fit for office, he was not fit for office in 2020 or 2019. From 2017 onward, it was publicly obvious that Joe Biden was not fit for any office of responsibility. No corporation would have chosen a Joe Biden type of person with that obvious periodic senility to lead them. And so that part of the critique, I think, was important. It just saying the obvious is a service, and many people will simply not have the fortitude, right? Maybe one person in 100 or one person in 1,000 will have the fortitude to say the obvious, right? You should not expect, for example, Asian females to have the same disciplinary level of problems as other groups. They are simply not as physically aggressive. Men are on average 10 times more physically aggressive than women. And to make that obvious point will get you fired from a lot of prestigious positions.
Okay, I mean, let me just circle it back, and then I'll hang up because I got to get back to a very difficult project. But so the point I'm making is more one about media in general, and then conservative media. So conservative media came in there and played a very important role in providing a perspective that was not available in the mainstream media. And in some ways, when conservative media grew and became more popular, it made the mainstream media redundant to some extent. I mean, it's still good, like you, I still check in on the mainstream media and see what's, the actual hard news. But conservative media played that role. But now we're kind of coming full circle where now that you have just anyone can post on social media and do their own kind of investigative reporting or just give their own take on the internet, on YouTube, wherever it might be. It's almost like conservative media is also becoming a little redundant. And when I see Megyn Kelly, who again I like, doing her thing, it's almost like I feel like she's just reading the news and just talking about it. And therefore, conservative media has become a little redundant to the extent that just independent people can do the same, but with more freedom and more panache and do it with a little bit higher level analysis.
Okay, so here's where I differ. I think we profoundly need support for our narratives, and we need people who can articulate them better than we can. And so when you have a useful pundit, it's often someone who can describe what's happening in reality more pithily, accurately, and precisely than you can. So to the extent the conservative media can reinforce and articulate reality better than the consumer of conservative media, they're doing a service.
Well, that I can agree. So we'll end on a note of agreement, 40. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks. So